I can't. Good. I think we should be online. So, good morning, United States. Good afternoon, Europe, and wherever else you are in the world. My name is Carsten Schradin. I'm a director of research at the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, and currently at the Sakulenko Research Station in South Africa, where today we have 37 degrees. And I'm happy to be the host of today's fine seminar. And first, I would like to look back to last week, where we had a very interesting talk about burrowing beetles by Nick Royal. If you haven't seen it live, you can still go on our YouTube page and see it there. And next week, there won't be any presentation because I think there's a celebration in the United States, a strange holiday they call Thanksgiving or something like this. You might in Europe have heard about it. And then in 2 weeks, we will have Melanie Damham from the University of Münster. She's going to talk about patterns and consequences of individual variation in landscapes of fear, who takes risk and does it matter. But today it's my great pleasure that we have Jacobus Boomsma as a speaker. Jacobus, or Koos, how he prefers to be called. He is a real very influential person in our field of social evolution. He is originally from Netherlands. He's Dutch. He did his PhD in Amsterdam in 1982, then did different postdocs before 1999. He became a professor in Denmark at the University of Copenhagen, and since then he's there. He's the director of the Center for Social Evolution, studying social insects, kin selections, and molecular mechanisms of sociality. He has been studying fungus growing atta ants for more than 25 years, so really long-term studies. And he has had a great influence on our field on many different levels. For example, 23 of his former PhD students are postdocs in the meantime, are permanent researchers working in our or related fields. He has been on the editorial board of 10 different journals in different times. He has more than 20,000 citations, H-index from 80, and more than 340 papers. Out of this, 5 in Nature, 7 in Science, 10 in PNAS, 8 in Current Biology, 5 in Nature Communication, 5 in Nature Ecology and Evolution. So really having a great impact on our field. And for example, just this month there has been, where he's a co-author, a commentary published in Nature about how fungus farming ants have nourished biology for 150 years. So if you want, you can have a look at this very recent paper that just came out this month. He also just published a book, and even though he has been so productive, he only published 2 books in his life so far, showing that when he writes a book, it's really something that he thinks it's very important. That is on the domains and major transitions of social evolution. And of course, here we are all very interested in social evolution and maybe also in major transitions. So I'm very much looking forward, Koos, to your presentation today about social evolution.
Right. So thank you very much for this kind introduction, and see what I can share my screen and make this all happen. Think we're here, and then we go to full screen. Does that not work now? Yes, you see things full screen, everybody?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Okay. So let me get started in with this rather provocative title, at least I think for people that have been in this field for quite a while. A little caveat, I will be talking about abandoning broad brush eusociality, as from the early days of social biology that became a term that has been around in the literature, and to my mind in a rather confusing way, so that we best get rid of it. And I will explain why I think that. You have already introduced my background a little bit. Let me very briefly say a few things about that myself. For my early career, I studied sex allocation, relatedness, asymmetries, and worker offspring control in ants and to some extent bees, which was tightly connected to the study of social insect mating systems, because genetic markers to do that had just become available. We call them allozymes. It seems Stone Age technology now, but it worked pretty well. And from that, I started to become interested in actually interactions with symbionts, mutualistic for most part, but sometimes also parasitic. And that is where these fungus growing ants and fungus growing termites pictures come from. And it dawned on me fairly early on, but increasingly in precise terms, that really these commitments in mating and with symbionts in the ants and the termites are two sides of the same coin. Apart from that, I worked for a while on army ant mating systems when Daniel Kronauer was my PhD student on Ophiocordyceps zombie ants, when David Hughes was a postdoc on ants social parasites with David Nash, and most recently on ant microbiomes, either on the cuticle, as you can see to the left there, or in the gut. But really, all of this was ultimately driven by a deep interest in developing and testing inclusive fitness theory, and that is what I'm going to talk about. So an increasing interest in the recent 15 years or so in what I have called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Probably others have used this term before, but what you usually see is reference to a modern synthesis, which now is decidedly unmodern in many respects. What I mean with neo-Darwinian synthesis is the things that led up to inclusive fitness theory and Bill Hamilton's seminal work. And that resulted in two books in 2022. One was a republication of Julian Huxley's first book, The Individual and the Animal Kingdom, which I did together with Rick Gaughan, my then Fulbright fellow. And the other is my own monograph, basically trying to outline not only the history, but also where it led us in terms of insights that we have today. So if you like, the very beginning of the neo-Darwinian synthesis and my synthesis towards the end in the 2020s. This was co-driven by frustration about the lexicon or the terminology set that we have. Because in my view, and as I was educated, mature natural science needs a stringent lexicon, otherwise it cannot be good science. And you only have to look at physics and chemistry and at the typical terminology they use to conclude that, in fact, across the globe, physicists and chemists agree about what these terms mean. But then you go to organismal biology and you get organisms, individuals, societies, queens, workers, caste, cooperation, altruism, and in particular, eusociality, superorganisms, and major transitions. And in fact, there is no consensus at all about how these should be defined. And that is really, I think, a very problematic situation we're in. So, essentially, we concluded some years ago that much of this is due to what I, for today, coined the follies of Wilsonian social biology. Two books as they hit the field in the 1970s as the first monographs pretty much that were available to my generation when we were in graduate school. And for those that don't have English as their mother tongue, follies are things that lack good sense. They're costly ornaments without practical purpose. And indeed, these were glossy volumes with nice illustrations, but filled with just so stories. Now, that's not a term I invented, that the early critics used that, and most particularly Philip Kitcher in an 85 book criticized the entire approach as being incoherent and really on the brink of not really being science. Rereading all that, I have to come to agree. But the legacy was that we got stuck with a term like eusociality. Because what Wilson really did in these books is develop a theory of eusociality, emphasizing rather unspecified social progress by unspecified group selection. And that has hardly been attacked after the first 10 years of social biology, but it's remained a significant problem. Because what eusociality does, it emphasizes a state or different states, defined as cooperative brood care, reproductive division of labor, generation overlap. But these are not traits that can respond to selection. So eusociality, as it's defined, cannot evolve because it cannot do that, which I think is a major problem. And we get back to some of that later on. At the same time, Wilson backgrounded standard understanding of social adaptation through natural selection. That is the entire legacy of Darwin, Weismann, and William Morton Wheeler, his eminent and specialist predecessor at Harvard before World War II. Eusociality theory, as framed by Wilson, was unable to make a single testable prediction. But what it did was borrow Hamilton's haplodiploidy hypothesis, which was a mechanistic hypothesis, and it is one of the few hypotheses by Bill that is probably wrong. It's the idea that haplodiploid genetics will make it more likely that you evolve forms of reproductive altruism than diplodiploids do, that may be having some merit for cooperative breeding, but it certainly doesn't have for caste societies. So we are going to take it from there. Oh, wait a sec, I'm going too fast here. I'm a bit handicapped by not being able to see my bottom text here, but you will have been able to read what that says. So let's move on. So Wilson's dismissal of his predecessors has really been quite consistent and blatant, and it started already before his 1971 volume came out, and it was published for the first time in an obscure French journal that I gave the title of that. It is no longer retrievable from the web, but some people have a copy. If you want one, I can email it to you. But because of all this eusociality jargon, insect social evolution lost its stringent definitions to the detriment of conceptual transparency. It basically did away with what Weismann and Wheeler had formulated as being the quintessential characteristics of social insects that have permanent castes. That is the superorganismal concept, which Wheeler in 1911 and 10 published, both in a book and in a paper, defining an ant colony, and this applies to a honeybee colony as well, or a stingless bee colony, as an organism of a higher level, with its own ontogeny, its own development, and irreversible differentiation of all parts, emphasizing the development during the larval stage as an analogous process to how cell lines develop during the embryonic stage of a metazoan animal. He also modeled Wheeler's developmental definition of what a caste is by saying, oh, any behavioral difference will qualify as a caste, making also that a rather confusing term. And that led to the reinvention of a totally different superorganism in 29 in a book by Björn Huldover, which is just inspired by some awesome harmony type of progress idea, which really wasn't the idea originally of William Morton Wheeler. He misappropriated the real definitions of eusociality, which were narrow and correct, by Susanna Batra, a Michener student, and by Julian Huxley himself in a monograph Plants by 1930. And all that meant was obligate helpers at the nest, something in insect reminiscent of naked mole rats, which were then unknown as being social. So really, Wilson's eusociality was always incompatible with Hamilton's inclusive fitness theory. It was not just something that happened in 2010 when that paper by Nowak, Tanita, and Wilson was published. It was never a match, and he just became vocal about it towards the end of his career. So what we started to do, and for the first time in a 2018 review, is reinstating the classic understanding by the giants of Darwinism. With my former Fulbright fellow Rick Gahn, we produced this review on what the superorganism had originally been meant to be and how it basically was lost in translation, going back all the way to luminaries like Huxley, Wheeler, Weismann, and Darwin to reconstruct how termini got confused when biology started to focus on data rather than concept, because this was typical for around 1970 when Wilson was developing these ideas, that he was competing with Jim Watson one floor away in Harvard for the attention of the funding agencies. So he tried to develop a form to make social insects interesting and in particular for a wider audience. And that led to a lot of problems. As we conclude in that paper, and I cite from the final paragraph here, we explain that the root cause of these flaws in the modern use of the superorganism is the generalized definition of eusociality that came into fashion when sociobiology took off. This definition merely emphasized loose similarities in cooperative brood care, reproductive division of labor, and overlap in generations, thereby lumping all social breeders together in a single convenience category while ignoring the key significance of the presence or absence of permanent, physically differentiated queen and worker castes. So helper societies and caste societies are really very different things. They're not part of the eusociality continuum, and neither can one evolve from the other or back. They originated independently, for all we know, from solitary ancestors. So that's perhaps a rather provocative introduction, emphasizing Darwinian scholarship, taking precedence over shallow, just those stories. Making explicit, or trying to do that, and I will continue to do that in the rest of the talk, that facultative, condition-dependent altruism, what you know in vertebrates as cooperative breeding, is really something completely different from obligate, unconditional altruism, what you know from the workers, from termites, ants, honeybees, stingless bees, and bumblebees, and even one clade of wasps. They're not directly comparable, even though inclusive fitness theory capture them both. And here is, I think, the key thing that hasn't been realized, neither has it been formally proven, but all the comparative data illustrate that condition-dependent altruism never went to fixation to produce obligate altruism, defined as queen and worker caste. And neither the other way around. Neither once you have an ant could that ever develop into simple altruistic helpers at the nest. There's a few intriguing cases where the queen caste got lost, but you can see you only have specialized workers and some just secondarily regained reproductive functionality or lay eggs, parthenogenetically, but it is not the return to cooperative breeding where you freely choose to stay and help or disperse and breed on your own. So broad brush eusocial really adds nothing to social. It just became a buzzword in the way it is used in the literature. You find this all hard to believe? Have a look at one of Wilson's last books, The Social Conquest of Earth, where he explains what drove him to develop the theory of eusociality. And this is after the famous Nowak et al. Paper. So that was the first part of what I would like to say today. I'm going to have two more parts, which hopefully will keep me more or less in time. So after this introduction, the question arises, why is the confused social biology lexicon a problem? And even in my view, a fundamental conceptual and even empirical problem, because it compels us not necessarily to ask the right questions when we do empirical research. But for starters, it erroneously suggests that eusociality terminology, that organismal biology is a soft science, or artificial construct terms come and go as a matter of fashion, because Wilson basically made up an entire new jargon around eusociality. There was no match with Darwin, Weismann, Wheeler, Huxley, even all the way through to later authors. Darwin formulated, and it's important to make that explicit here, his theory of evolution by natural selection is a predictive and testable set of concepts about adaptation. That was very similar for Hamilton, except that he went one spade deeper. He formulated inclusive fitness theory as an even more general, gene's eye neo-Darwinian theory, allowing many novel testable predictions about social adaptations that would have been impossible by using Darwin's paradigm. All this happened, particularly in Hamilton's case, in the spirit of Karl Popper's philosophy that what science is about is to make daring conjectures and to try to reject the logic of those theories. And as long as you don't succeed in doing that, you provisionally assume you have a strong theory. Both Darwinism and neo-Darwinism have been corroborated by empirical evidence countless times. That is the term Popper uses. You never prove a theory because every theory is provisional, but you corroborate it by particular daring consequences that get tested and proved to be correct. So biology, again, I can't read what I wrote here, so I will just skip that because your portraits are somehow in the way. But that is one reason. It suggests we don't have a hard science. But there's a deeper reason behind all this, and that is that really evolutionary theory, going back to Darwin, is all about adaptation by natural selection. It was Weismann who made that most explicit, even before the turn of the last century. But really, when you read the origin, it's clear that it is about the origin of adaptation, because that is what Darwin very well understood. Speciation, he couldn't understand really well. So the title, The Origin of Species, is in some way misleading. Darwin was also very clear that adaptations are almost never perfect. So he wasn't an adaptationist, to use that term. He very well knew that many adaptations are no longer optimal, but they just do their job. The evolutionary tinkering expression was developed later to describe that. The person, in my view, that formulated this most clearly, even before Hamilton, was Colin Pittendrigh, a Dobzhansky student that was the founding father of chronobiology, but he wrote this beautiful book chapter in 1958, where he says the following. Concepts of adaptation and natural selection are so interwoven that it's impossible to misunderstand one without doing violence to the other. Study of adaptation is not an optional preoccupation with fascinating fragments of natural history. It is the core of biological study, because the living system is all adaptation insofar as it is organized. And he elaborates that a little bit by saying that adaptation is the total organization of a living system, where organization is always relative to an end, like an army is organized relative to beating an enemy, and where the alternative or the converse of adaptation is randomness. So every adaptive state somehow is between something non-adaptive, random, something perfectly adapted that is almost never achievable, but you cannot basically ignore adaptation when you study biology. And that is the point he was making. Just to illustrate how Popperian Bill Hamilton's theory was, it's an interesting quote from his later autobiographical writings, In My Intended Burial and Why, where he writes this. My ideas about kin selection were at last written down and submitted to a journal. I was pretty sure they were right, that is, I was sure they were correctly argued. If they were, it was clear that no amount of evidence from nature would make them wrong, or if it did, then at least for my comfort, Darwin's and Fisher's version of evolution, perhaps along with all of Mendel's genetics, would have to come crashing down as well. So back to the idea that societies, conditional altruism, and superorganisms, neuter caste colonies, are fundamentally different. Darwin was the first to realize what you need to get neuter caste, obligately altruistic workers. He writes actually many pages on social insights. It is a significant part of the entire book devoted to this, because he needed to solve that problem, to not be criticized. And after many pages, he has this conclusion: with these facts before me, I believe that natural selection, by acting on the fertile parents, could form a species which should regularly produce neuters. That went into history as Darwin's family selection idea. It's very important to realize that this is not group selection. This is 2 lifetime committed parents. It wouldn't work with 3 parents. And groups are always bigger than that, and not lifetime committed either. Now, that view of how neuter caste had been evolving in the bee and in the ants and in the termites stayed a canonical explanation for a century, all the way from Darwin to Weismann, Wheeler, Huxley, Fisher, and in the end, George Williams, who in his trailblazing book, Adaptation and Natural Selection of '66, basically has the same vision of how neuter caste evolves. Now, nothing of that is ever mentioned in E.O. Wilson's book. It is just all backgrounded. It is not considered to be important. But the conclusion is really interesting. It means that obligate altruism, neuter caste, was understood a century before Hamilton developed his theory for facultative altruism. Facultative altruism that usually is in open societies, like you know, in cooperative breeding vertebrates, something fundamentally different. And Hamilton was inspired not by ants or by honeybees or by haplodiploidy, but by explaining the social interactions of humans, and the closest analogy he could find of natural non-cultural systems were Palestine wasps. So this is, I think, fundamental to make this distinction, and you cannot do that with eusociality. It also has the interesting implication that societies with helpers are not necessarily less impressive than superorganisms with permanent caste. There's a nice example from the wasps here, the Dolichovespula yellow jacket colony versus a swarm founding Polystine colony from Panama. It's clear that the society of swarm founders is perennial. It makes one module every year, so this nest is about 6 or 7 years old, and each model is about the same size as the annual Dolichovespula colony. But the wasps in that swarm founding Panamanian colony, they don't have real castes. They have a bit of size variation that maybe makes it more likely for the bigger ones to breed than for the smaller ones, whereas the superorganismal annual Dolichovespula colony has a distinctly larger founding queen, where there is really dichotomous variation in size and behavior between her and her workers. So, eusociality, just defined as cooperative brood care, reproductive division of labor, generation overlap, does not allow appreciation of the fundamental difference between adult reproductive role differentiation, reproductive skew, if you like, and pre-imaginal caste differentiation. And that is, in fact, it doesn't help you to see what 19th century evolutionary biology already understood and what 20th century Hamiltonian neo-Darwinism added to that understanding. Having said that, we can actually use Hamilton's rule to understand both of them. Helper societies and caste societies are two sides of the same inclusive fitness, same Hamilton's rule coin, if you like. So if you express Hamilton's rule in its simplest possible way, where you make the relatedness to offspring explicit, say an R naught, and you compare that to the relatedness of non-offspring, and you have the classic benefits and costs, all as originally intended by Bill. All you need to do, that's often been done before, is rearrange that expression in two ratios, one relatedness ratio and one cost-benefit ratio, and then start asking yourself the question, when is that ratio a variable and when is it a constant? And that produces actually interesting differences that are compatible with the Darwin, Weismann, Wheeler discovery of neuter castes and the Hamiltonian understanding of cooperative breeding. When that ratio is a variable, Hamilton's rule is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for the evolution of condition-dependent individual altruism in open societies. This is Hamilton's lasting contribution to evolutionary biology that was incredibly important. However, when that ratio is a constant, you partition Hamilton's rule, because the relatedness ratio, if it's 1, it cancels out of the equation. So you partition it into a mathematical equivalence necessary condition and a sufficiency condition that is simply whether the B over C condition lasted long enough to rewire obligately altruistic individuals into developmentally specialized worker caste. So here's the same expressed in a slightly different way to make clear that the extreme conditions of the variation at both ends are important. So the relatedness ratio can be 0 or 1, and it can be in between. And the 0 one, we've known forever that it was important. Okay, let me say first, all current inclusive fitness theory for helper society life, cooperative breeders in insects and vertebrates, are captured by this Hamiltonian range. But we've known that altruism cannot evolve if relatedness is 0. In that sense, Hamiltonian neo-Darwinism reduces to classic Darwinism. Whereas this condition really gives us the necessary and sufficient conditions for transitions to a higher level of organismality. That is, conditions to get Wheeler superorganismality to evolve. Relatedness to non-offspring needs to be invariably maximum to be a necessary condition for selection for obligate collective altruism, both for cellular and multicellular germline soma differentiation. So the same argument applies to the evolution of multicellularity and the evolution of superorganismality. It's easy to see that because the relatedness ratio can be won both by dividing 100% by 100% and by dividing 50% by 50%. 100% is a copy of a unicellular protist that is clonal, that either disperses or that hangs on to the zygote to become a multicellular thing. And in the insects and vertebrates, you just have siblings versus offspring. And if there's lifetime monogamy, sibling relatedness is equal to offspring relatedness. Also in haploid diploidy, because there the 50% is the average between 75% and 25%. All right, that was my second part. So I'd like to close off with a third part and asking this question. Why is this hypothesis-driven view, I think, parsimonious and appealing? At least it is to me, and I hope to get some of you at least on board in agreeing with me. First reason is that actually the empirical data show that it has worked like this. Major transitions in multicellularity, superorganismality did arise from lifetime parental commitment. So let me start with the multicellularity case that was made a little over 10 years ago by Bertie Fisher, who did a comparative analysis in the multicellular developments showing that you needed clonal ancestry to become obligately multicellular. So looking at that histogram, you can see that all lineages that have permanent obligate multicellularity have clonal ancestry, but not all the clonal ancestry lineages became obligate multicellularity, exactly illustrating that relatedness equivalence of dispersing cells, staying cells was a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. None of the non-clonal lineages ever produced permanent multicellularity. Going over to a paper a couple of years earlier that showed that ancestral monogamy shows that kin selection is key to the evolution of eusociality. It should have written superorganismality because the hypothesis, the monogamy hypothesis, was not developed to explain Wilsonian eusociality, but only caste differentiated colonies. And we see the same pattern. The key figure here shows that strict monogamous parentage was a necessary but not a sufficient condition. It originally looked at eusociality, so everything social in the Hymenoptera, but really the major transitions should be higher up in the tree, not for the ants, but for the vespine wasps and the corbiculate bees. So halictid bees do not make caste societies. Allodapine bees do not either. And you can see that even though the origins of caste societies are higher up, multiple insemination of queens, either obligate or facultative, always arose after these major transitions to caste societies had become irreversible. So the data are consistent with the lifetime commitment monogamy idea. And in my book, I phrase that as the non-redundant closure principle. It's a universal condition for organismality. That sounds like a very technical term. I couldn't think of something better. But really, the principle is as simple as 2 is a pair and 3 is a crowd at the foundation of organisms and superorganisms. So you have 2 parents lifetime committed to a zygote, or 2 parents lifetime committed to an insect colony. But whether pairwise lifetime commitment is intra or interspecific doesn't really matter. So as long as outbreeding prevails, a complementary female and male gamete in a zygote works in the same way as the origin of the first eukaryote cell, which had the complementary commitment between a single nucleus and a single mitochondrial clone. And the monogamy hypothesis is the same between 2 multicellular parental bodies. So really, this universal condition of non-redundant closure doesn't need to have a single cell wall as in the first eukaryote cell, but it can also be functional in the way multicellular bodies and superorganisms arose. Any form of redundancy in the form of chimerism, say 2 sperms fertilizing 1 egg, or a queen mated with 2 males, would be destructive if that happens before a major transition has become irreversible. And that is what characterizes society. Kin selection, maintaining societies, and creating levels of organismality are 2 sides of the same Hamiltonian coin. This is restating what I've told you before. The organismal other side of Hamilton's coin splits a dynamic inequality, which is Hamilton's rule, into a static mathematical necessity and an empirically sufficient condition, which is just B over C being fulfilled. It isn't an easy condition because as you have to establish deeply ingrained developmental programs for making queen and worker caste in the larval stage, that condition needs to be fulfilled for a very long time without interruptions. That is why we don't have many superorganismal lineages. We have 1 in the ants, 1 in the bees, corbiculate bees, 1 in the wasps, and 1 in the termites. But they're all characterized by a nested, domesticated level of organismality that goes over 4 levels in nature as we know it on our planet. And it's always about germinalization and somatization. So take a honeybee worker as an example of a member of a caste colony to the right. That worker body is a differentiated multicellular body that is built of complex eukaryote cells, and each of those cells has a mitochondrial remnant of a prokaryote ancestry. So this is how life built up its levels of organismality. Coexisting levels of selection define helper societies, but they're only secondary relevant in superorganisms, when secondarily, for example, you get multiple queen societies or multiple insemination of queens, you get some levels of selection back, but it's usually tightly regulated, in contrast to societies where conflict is usually apparent. So major transitions are irreversible by definition, in my view, and societies can form at each level of organismality. So here's one of the final figures in my book that summarize that. We had the first prokaryote cell, the first eukaryote cell, a handful of transitions to multicellular organismality, and a handful animal transitions, insect transitions to colonial superorganismality. Societies evolved at each particular level. We know of prokaryote cell societies, Myxococcus bacteria, eukaryote cell societies in Dictyostelium, societies of multicellular individuals, excuse me, in Palestine wasps, which I showed you, and also in vertebrate cooperative breeders. But no society ever made a major transition to a higher level society, except in humans. We are a totally exceptional major transition that was culturally driven and not by lifetime monogamy or the equivalent of that. Irreversible transitions, but it doesn't preclude that secondary reductions can happen, particularly when lower levels become mutualistic or parasitic. So we know of mitochondria that are reduced bacteria, but they still look like prokaryotes. We know of protists that lost the mitochondria when they became parasitic. We know of parasitic plants that lost the chloroplasts, but remain, of course, multicellular. And we know of ant social parasites that have no workers, but they still look like ants, not like solitary digger wasps. So reduction is not to be confused with reversibility. Helper societies are often reversible. So there's halicted bees that high up in the mountains are solitary, and they have helpers in the nest in the valley. That is never happening in superorganisms. Inclusive fitness theory can thus explain both the dynamics, the Hamiltonian dynamics, and the statics, going back to Darwin, Weismann, and Wheeler, social evolution, provided we admit that explanations are always about statistical odds, explaining part of the variance. Biology is not like deterministic Newtonian physics, where we can just have equations to predict everything. We know that the confirmation, the corroboration, I should say, of inclusive fitness theory has been truly impressive. That came out of the rebuttal paper by Abbott et al. Of the paper by Noah, Tanita, and Wilson that I already mentioned, has this very interesting table. Inclusive fitness theory has been important in understanding a range of behavioral phenomena. 14 different fields. Correlation or evidence had always a tick. Experimental evidence had always a tick. The interplay between theory and data very much in Popper's philosophy, spirit, same thing. So really, if you look at a table like this, there is an overarching reason to conclude that very simple overarching equations like Hamilton's rule, comparable in simplicity to what Albert Einstein wrote down for his theories, that comparison is reasonable. And many of these predictions were not immediately corroborated. They came much later. I think most of you remember that the confirmation of gravitational waves was less than 10 years ago. Hamilton didn't predict that his theory would become relevant for parasite virulence, but it did. So all I really added with the monogamy hypothesis, with the lifetime commitment hypothesis, is to develop the static aspect of inclusive fitness theory and argue that that is a branch of inclusive fitness theory that can explain the major transitions in organismality. Neo-Darwinism, Hamiltonian Darwinism, statistical, price equation, mathematics these days, that form of modern inclusive fitness theory reduced classic Darwinism to a special case for interactions among non-relatives. Remember, when the relatedness ratio is 0, everything in Hamilton's theory reduces to normal Darwinism. Just like Einstein's relativity theory reduced Newton's mechanics to a special case valid only when observers do not move. It is inclusive fitness theory that makes organismal biology a hard science. And just as an aside, if you are worrying, is this applicable outside social evolution? I think the genes I view similarly solved that sexual selection and natural selection are not two separate theories as Darwin originally maintained, but from a gene's eye perspective, they all fit the same paradigm. So we paid a price for broad brush eusociality, and that has been an unfortunate price. And I've summarized it in 3 bullet points here. Eusociality jargon inhibited the dialogue between students of vertebrates, social evolution, and invertebrate, social insect evolution. Simply, they often ended up having different chapters for the vertebrates and for the insects, even though their societies are quite comparable. It's only the superorganisms that never evolved in vertebrates, basically because vertebrates were never strictly monogamous enough to select for obligate collective altruism. Another reason is that eusociality terminology precluded for decades that a kin selection theory for the major transitions in evolution could be developed and tested. That's the thing I told you about. Basically because eusociality jargon made people wonder about the origin of social groups, the origin of colonies, the origin of societies, and they could never agree whether there really were major transitions. Well, they were not. Only superorganisms were major transitions. And eusociality jargon precluded seeing the wood for the trees there. Finally, broad brush eusociality was enforced on the field of behavior ecology, we didn't call it that way, to make ants relevant for societies. Ants was what Wilson knew about most. Legitimizing storytelling comparisons across all social systems, then we should never have gone that way. And in fact, it should have been clear. Wilson cites this book by Julian Huxley, 1930, and he has this wonderful quote, precluding that you compare superorganisms with human societies. Innumerable comparisons have been made between human society and the social organization of ants, bees, termites. Theories have been advanced and morals pointed, utopian schemes encouraged, and whole theories of the state built up for man on the basis of analogy with these little insects. Almost without exception, the moral has been false, the analogy misleadingly used. There is thus no reason to suppose that man is destined to sterilize nurses or manual workers, to breed armored or gas-resistant soldiers, or breed communal parents the size of whales, or an intelligentsia all head and no body. I think this was my last slide. Yes, just some acknowledgements. And to say that thank you for your patience. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Koos, for a really fascinating talk that will give lots of us a lot to think about. 50 minutes, 45 minutes, one cannot bring everything because it's a lot of important points. And as such, I expect there will be a lot of questions. So like always, if you have a question, please type a question mark into the chat. If you're a student, you can in brackets behind make an S, so I know that you're students because we preferably first give students priority to ask questions. Then I'll call you up. And first, then please introduce yourself, say your name, where you're from, what you're working, and then ask your questions. And we're going through like this. For the people on YouTube, I already wrote in the chat. If you have a question on YouTube, write your question in the chat. Also here, say who you are, and I will then transfer the question into the Zoom meeting here. And we start with a question by Maren Hook.
Hello, my name is Maren Hock. I'm at the University of Derby in the UK. And I'm old enough to make a fool of myself and ask questions that might seem very silly to you, probably, because I'm coming from more vertebrate biology rather than insect biology, so I have little background. Only the textbook background. And so I have a couple of questions where I wasn't quite sure I understood what you said. It was fascinating what you said and very interesting, and I like to think more about it, but I just want to make sure I have understood everything, essentially. Well, I won't have understood everything, but anyway. So the first thing, the first question was about that you said that the haplodiploid theory was wrong, but you didn't further explain why you thought so, because from my understanding, it was essentially just a special case of kin selection, and kin selection you very strongly supported in your talk. So why is haplodiploid theory not working, but kin selection is working? So that's the first question. And the other very different question is
Shall I answer this one first?
Okay, yeah, fine.
Well, the whole idea of haplodiploidy was based on the mistaken assumption that workers are more related to their sisters than they are to their daughters. But that idea was already shot down by Bob Trivers when he was at Harvard, when he realized that actually that as long as the sex ratio is 50-50, then you have to also invest in brother siblings, and to those you are only related by 25%. So the average between 25 and 75 is 0.50. So the advantage of haplodiploidy isn't really there. What matters is actually, and that is what I try to develop with the idea of lifetime monogamous commitment, is that the equality itself is very important. It's not that there was a relatedness advantage. Now, have social systems evolved more often in the haplodiploid, bees, wasps, and ants than they have in diploids, termites? There are actually also social ambrosia beetles. There's a number of other cases. Actually, if you would put those cases into a formal chi-square test, I don't think anything significant would come out of that. But having said that, the jury is still out among the modelers. Some models still seem to suggest that there may have been some facilitating effects of haplodiploidy, while others cannot really find it. So I'd be willing to say that the jury is still out, but I don't think that the hypothesis itself is very appealing any longer. And it had a serious side effect in that it made people believe that Hamilton's ideas were about haplodiploidy. And that was a serious mistake because, as I try to explain, Bill was actually interested in explaining social interactions of conditional altruism across all societies, including humans, and not particularly about what happened in the haplodiploid insects.
Okay, thank
Next.
you. Do they have an equal sex ratio always?
No, they haven't. And that is, in fact, a very interesting issue. But that is not reasonable to assume that right from the beginning, when caste societies evolved, that they necessarily had a skewed sex ratio. There's this famous theory by Trivers and Hare that basically predicted if workers are in control of the sexual investments, you should get a 3-to-1 sex ratio in terms of investments rather than 1-to-1. And that has been tested, that has been shown kind of to work. But the best evidence really came when we realized that if you can make that happen within the same population where relatedness asymmetries differ between colonies, and you can get that that contrasts that high relatedness colonies produce more females and low relatedness colonies more males, and that is gone into the literature as split sex ratio theory, and that produced a fair bit of reasonable evidence that that idea that offspring workers control in a number of species, not in all of them, the sexual investments, that that has merit.
Okay, thank you.
But it's a secondary development, right? It isn't something that is necessarily compelling to assume for the origin of these systems.
Okay. Shall I ask my other question later, or so that others can first ask questions?
If it fits directly to it, ask it now. There's not too many questions pending. If it's a different topic, then wait. So
it's a different topic.
Then make another question mark, and then we move on to a question by David Queller.
Hi, Koos. Interesting as always. I'm Dave Queller for everybody else. I used to work on social insects, on polystyene wasps especially, and now work on social amoebas. And it's actually social amoebas I wanted to ask you about, and we've talked about this some before, but I'm still somewhat confused about what your views are. And in particular, during the talk, you presented Bertie Fisher's comparative study. We're looking for a phylogenetic correlation between perfectly high relatedness and the evolution of the major transition to multicellularity. She had social amoebas classified as clonal, which fits with the fact that fits with her hypothesis that you need to be clonal in order to make that transition. Yet later on, when you briefly talked about slime molds, you described them as societies, which makes sense for your hypothesis in a sense, because relatedness is not, in fact, fully clonal. Relatedness is high in the slime mold societies, but not fully clonal. So it's not entirely clear to me what your view is. And in particular, my view is that they're kind of an exception to your view, that they are not fully clonal, and yet they have evolved permanent caste, in the sense that some cells fully give up their lives, commit their lives to produce the stock that altruistically benefits the others' dispersal as spores. Moreover, I think fitting with your view of them as societies, there is some conflict within those non-clonal groups as well. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Dave, for the opportunity to try and be a bit clearer. So in my view, there is a fundamental difference between coming together and staying together. So permanent multicellularity, also in Bertie Fisher's analysis, basically is about staying together. You have a zygote and cells adhere. They don't disperse. Whereas the dictyostelium slime molds are a coming together system because these cells need to find each other on the forest floor and need to become a certain number of them before they can make their fruity bodies. Coming together per definition excludes permanent clonal relatedness. You just can't avoid that once in a while a non-clone mate will sneak in, whereas in staying together, clonality is maintained. So yes, there are many conflicts in slime mold societies, and there's more of them than I think in many permanent multicellular lineages. Because staying together, basically you have agreed that you have no resource acquisition conflict at all, because when two gametes have committed to a zygote, basically they're lifetime committed in the same boat. They either succeed together building a multicellular body, or they perish together. None of that applies to societies of cells. So I call them cell societies, right? In analogy with societies like polystyene wasps that are one level higher. Now, why do I consider them that way, it's not only because they're coming together rather than staying together. It's also when you look at the phylogenetic evidence, there is no slime mold that ever has made it to permanent multicellularity. There's no branch in that entire group that has done it. Only the sister group, which is the fungi and the animals, that have realized that. And that's very analogous to, say, Palestine wasps and Vespine wasps. One has stayed societies forever because they couldn't get that non-redundant form of commitment to work, whereas that did work in the Vespine wasps. So I think the logic is reasonably coherent. We always feel also a bit sorry we don't have more comparative data on other systems that may show the same thing. And in that sense, I will be the first to say that you can't prove colony theories like this. You can just corroborate them by the evidence that you have. And it remains a hypothesis, just like inclusive fitness theory, in fact, remains a hypothesis, even though we've grown quite confident over the decades that it is the light and the way. I don't know whether that answers enough of your question, Dave, or whether you want to follow up on that.
It gets part of the way there. It seems to me you're putting more, I thought you were putting a lot of emphasis on whether they had evolved castes or not and complete commitment to your colony. You're saying that, and the Simons do have that, in spite of not having perfect relatedness, but you're saying what perhaps is more important is how permanent the castes are, that they don't go through a single cell stage.
Yes, I forgot about that, so thanks. Being a system where there's units, in this case the cells, come together, doesn't preclude some cell differentiation in cell types. And I think that would also mean that if you take it one level up to the social insects, it's not completely excluded that you can get cell differentiation. Individual differentiation, like we know of soldier caste in thrips and aphids, for example, where the other colony members are perfectly totem. Bertie Fisher did a follow-up study a couple of years later where she elaborated a number of these things and actually showed that there were quite good correlations between cell number and the type of organismality that you had. And I think she had an allometry slope, if I remember well now, that actually bended at roughly 5 or 6 cell types, if I remember right now. So when a coming together type of system, I think Dictyostelium was probably the maximum there, having about 5 or 6 cell types. That was what you could get in the comparative data. And again, I will be the first to admit that, of course, the resolution and the amount of data we had was limited, but it came out significant. And then you have the larger systems, which are all staying together multicellular, and they evolved higher numbers of cell types. So it's not totally black and white in this particular sense, but I think the grouping of, say, staying together versus coming together, the complexity of the systems that came out of that stays very distinct.
Okay, I think we could go on for a couple hours, but we should move on to other topics.
Okay, but thank you. Also, thank you for David for this very nice question. I mean, I had a similar, less formulated question on the bottom of my list, showing me how much I learned from David's fine talk he gave 1 or 2 years ago, and maybe many other in the fine community had a similar question in their mind. So I think it was important. But before I come to my own question, I give priority to students, and we have a student question on YouTube from Rachel Schulz, a PhD student at the University of Michigan. She asks, what can we learn from how this confusion of eusociality terminology occurred to prevent something like this happening again in the future? A very big and difficult question.
Yeah, interesting though. Well, I mean, my personal view is that much of the early development of social biology was political. It wasn't scientific. And it's been quite often argued that the political critics were driven by Marxism, but I think that Wilson himself made some choices that could hardly be defended as being scientific, because he should have known most of the stuff that I've been introducing you to that were from before World War II. Even the book by George Williams, 1966, which I found a trailblazing volume when I was a graduate student, is ignored. And what typically, he cites those books and then he cites them for a trivial detail and ignores the main message. And I think there's a pattern there. I have a review paper on the way dealing with the details, so I won't bore you with all of that now. So I think what is crucial really is that when you claim to present a new synthesis, and that is what social biology had as its subtitle, you should be very careful to basically go back to the literature long enough and to respect the contributions of the people that came before you, and to synthesize whether the views that you can add, actually, you can make them harmonize with your new insights. And I don't think Wilson ever did anything like this. He just out of the blue started to introduce new terminology that actually took us centuries back in understanding. So I sometimes like to make the comparison between that in astronomy, it's a long time ago, we referred to what we could see in the night sky as celestial bodies without discriminating between whether they are stars, whether they are planets, whether they are satellites. Right? So much of the progress in astronomy over the last 500 years or so since Copernicus has been in that direction. More detailed first principle understanding of the hierarchies that apply. Now, what Wilson did relative to William Morton Wheeler was do the exact opposite. If you look at the last writings of Wheeler in 1934, shortly before he died, he published another review paper of what was understood about societies and superorganisms then. He's really very careful to keep them apart, just like anybody before him had done. Wilson just doesn't do it. He lumps it all in eusociality. And I still am amazed at my own generation, at myself, that it has taken us so long to basically start challenging that hopeless jargon. But here it is. And how can we prevent that from happening again? Well, be on the alert to see whether people are inventing new terms just because they sound good, without connecting them to first principle theory. It's not because the first principle Darwinian theory that we have is impeccable, but if you don't relate to what we understand from first principles, you're just going somewhere where it's unproductive to go. And in this case, it was unproductive for a couple of decades. Does that answer the question?
Oh, I cannot ask Rachel whether it answers her question, but it summarizes what you emphasize, that we need to base science on provable concepts, not on general wording. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there are lots of things in the modern literature that go a little bit that way, and of course I shouldn't sort of keep going onto side alleys here, but I mean, there's discussions about consciousness, for example, that I don't think are very sensible. What you typically see happen that people first start to water down existing definitions. And then they start to talk about, yeah, but this is like something else. And then suddenly, before you know it, you have a new conceptual framework, which are basically terms that are really artificial human constructs, right? So you invent a term and you start fitting reality in that term, rather than you do the opposite and consider that science and biology as we do it basically is about understanding reality itself and focusing on traits that can respond to selection. That is a tendency that we see increasing. And I just gave you one example, there's a few more. And
so Rachel,
that's unfortunate.
on YouTube. She seems to be happy. I'm still take the liberty to ask my own question. Like in the case of Maron, it might be that I have problems in understanding because I've been indoctrinated. So if my concept leading to the question is wrong, please interrupt me. So if I understood you is caste societies can evolve only when there's pure monogamy, where the relatedness coefficients is one, the relatedness to own offspring, like the offspring of the breeder, is the same. And if it's less than this, then it can lead to condition-dependent altruisms with so-called helpers at the nest. And you showed a nice comparative study. I also showed when I lecture on the social insects, where they always evolved from a purely monogamous ancestor. But what I did not understand is why you exclude the possibility that there was a helper at the nest society before the caste societies, why this cannot occur, and this then implements that you assume that the castes evolved out of nothing before, then breeders, they evolved directly from pure breeders. Can you comment on this problem of my understanding, or why one can exclude that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So there's two ways to answer that. Let me start with the empirical data. We simply know of no cases where, say, facultative helping in a particular clade has originated, and that from within that clade of species with facultative helping, there arose a clade that suddenly had made it obligatory and resulted for the insects in pre-imaginal caste differentiation. We don't know of these cases. They're at best sister groups, and often they are quite remote in the phylogeny, and you see either cooperative breeders, facultative helping evolve. Take the bees, we have that in the halictid bees, in the allodapine bees, and we only have one case of superorganismality evolving in the corbiculate bees. Same with the Palestine versus the Vespine wasps that I told you about. We also have no sister group of the ants that were cooperative breeding in the loose sense. The ants sort of came out of the blue, and you can always argue we missed the fossils or something like that. I admit that's a possibility, and it will always remain one. But it basically indicates that if that strict lifetime commitment, pairwise commitment, is fulfilled, the major difference with this cooperative breeders is that what that does is select for obligate collective altruism. So rather than selecting for an individual that has the option to disperse or to help, maybe for one season, for more season, has that flexibility. When you have the lifetime monogamy condition and it's really strict, then either you select for collective altruism of entire cohorts, or you don't get that. And that depends on the Hamiltonian benefits and the costs prevailing long enough. So that's why, in my view, there is no levels of selection issue in when you move levels of organismality, because under lifetime commitment, be it to gametes in a zygote, be it to parents in a colony, be it even the mitochondrion joining the nucleus in the first eukaryote cell, The level of selection jumps immediately to the higher level. So it's societies that are defined by two levels of selection. And that is why price equation kin selection theory for societies has also been formulated in levels of selection terms. There is no conflict there. But in the major transitions, you basically only secondarily have a lower level of selection kicking in. As I gave an example, when multiple insemination evolves secondarily after the major transition, you may get some conflicts that need to be taken care of. So it's collective altruism versus individual altruism, and it's no comparative data suggests that ever happened.
Okay, thank you. It brings me to some more questions I have, but I bring them afterwards. We move on to Owen Gilbert to ask, please. Owen, you're muted.
Hi, can you hear me?
No, it's good.
Hi, Dr. Boomsma. I appreciate your talk and your historical analysis of the history of ideas. And I agree with you about the importance of the relatedness from the father and monogamy, of course, and the evolution of social insect eusociality or altruism, as you'd want to call it. But the question I have for you and your perspective on this is, insects are highly mobile, so without nestimate recognition systems that could mix up their colonies, relatedness can drop to zero without nestimate recognition. And so is it really true that monogamy itself is sufficient if you also need nestimate recognition? And more generally, kin recognition seems to be ignored from this perspective. And this leads to a more general question I have, which is that it seems like to me that the very facts that you cite as evidence that inclusive fitness theory is a scientific theory, according to Popper's definition of science, I view as, according to his definition of pseudoscience, in the sense that a theory that always confirms itself no matter what the data say, is pseudoscientific. So just because a theory has a large empirical component and seems to always confirm itself doesn't necessarily mean that it's this hard scientific theory as you're arguing, especially when there's major areas like the field of kin recognition, which is now the leading source of citations for kin selection theory, which is a synonym of inclusive fitness theory. And yet there really are no realistic models coming from inclusive fitness theory that have ever explained the evolution of kin recognition. And at the same time, when Hamilton's rule has been tested in nature, people have purported to apply it to altruism, but they apply it to the decision of whether to join a group or not. And it's violated in Bork's analysis, his review, in 5 out of 10 studies that it was applied to association or group formation. And these violations of Hamilton's rule are not played up. They're not emphasized in textbooks. There's kind of a selective emphasizing of the confirmations of Hamilton's rule in textbooks. And Hamilton's rule also is applied selectively to kin, whereas a real scientific theory, according to Popper, would make risky predictions in the sense that it would make a prediction before measuring any of the parameters. So you would say, if you're going to consistently apply Hamilton's rule to the decision to join a group or not, you would apply it before you know relatedness, and then it would be violated every time it's applied to groups of non-relatives. And so to me, this idea that the confirmation that the theory, because it always confirms itself, is therefore scientific according to Popper, it completely misrepresents Popper's ideas. So that's
okay.
my comment question.
That's a lot, Owen. Let me see whether I can get to your different points. Or start with kin recognition. Kin recognition is a mechanism of keeping relatives together, right? It is not a theory. It is, to talk in Tinbergen terms, it is not an ultimate explanation, but it's approximate one of what mechanisms may be available to keep families together. Of course, we're ignorant about how these lifetime commitment systems originated, but it seems like a reasonable assumption that they may have been rare when they originated, and rare may mean that they were fairly far apart. So maybe the kin recognition idea was a moot point, because you also need to have an explanation for why males actually became monogamous and started philandering around to try and inseminate other females. So some spacing out seems a reasonable approximation, a reasonable assumption, but of course it's no proof that it happened like that. About the philosophy of Popper, I don't think anything of what I presented can be accused of being pseudoscience, because that entire table that I showed from Abbott et al. In 2011 about areas where inclusive fitness theory actually generated predictions that were later corroborated as not leading to rejection of the theory. Many of these were actually quite daring, quite unusual type of implications of inclusive fitness thinking. And the fact that they didn't result in outright rejections of the logic strengthened the theory quite considerably. I think that is the major point that Popper is trying to make. You never prove a theory, you only make it a little bit more probable, particularly by not being able to reject some of their outrageously looking predictions that nonetheless seem to have merit. So pseudoscience, as far as I remember, was mostly reserved for ideas that were metaphysical in nature. And it's true that he went wrong in interpreting evolutionary biology as a largely metaphysical science. But my idea why that happened is that mostly because he did not, in his older years, read the contributions by Hamilton and Williams. He was still alive then, but if he had a concept of the theory of adaptation, he would have had more positive thoughts about what this was like. The group formation type of thing, I personally don't like that terminology, because a group doesn't specify whether it's a family or whether it's something else. And again, that has to do with the coming together versus the staying together type of thing. And as long as you can't discriminate between them, you're bound to have inaccurate type of jargon, and it is a bit similar to the problems with eusociality.
I'd just say one primary thing in response to that, and I'll let other people ask questions. It's just that, say you said that Popper's idea was about talking about the metaphysics of a theory. But to me, the reason he distinguished pseudoscience, because if you think about it, the prior verificationist idea of science said that the reason something's scientific is that you confirm it by empirical data. And so, but Popper, and that contrasts to metaphysics where you don't even appeal to data. It's like, Plato pointing up to the sky and Aristotle to the ground. Aristotle is saying, we got to look at data, and Plato is saying we can have our theory and just appeal to ideas. So the verification
I appreciate all that, but I still maintain that everybody who goes out and do the next test of inclusive fitness theory and finds that the results are totally opposite to what you would predict, that would start putting the theory in doubt. So it isn't a theory that always gets corroborated, right?
Can I just finish what I was saying? Sorry. So the point about pseudoscience, the reason it's pseudoscience is that it has a large empirical component. And so the fact that something has a large empirical component doesn't mean it's science. And so
the main distinction is
so if
that
Hamilton's rule is violated half the time you test it and you just dismiss it as not important, then that's
pseudoscience never generates testable predictions. That's the difference between astrology and astronomy. If you go and
test your theory and you find it's violated and then you act like it's always confirmed, then that's pseudoscience. Popper talks about this. If you always make excuses for why the theory doesn't hold up and you ignore big anomalies like kin recognition, or
kin recognition is not an anomaly. It's a proximate mechanism that works.
Okay, it's something that's supposed to be explained by inclusive fitness. Has been taken as evidence for the theory for 50 years.
It's a mechanism of recognition.
There's no inclusive fitness model that can explain it, and it's totally ignored. This anomaly is ignored. And then people that write papers that actually explain it are censored. So to me, that is a big problem with the theory. And to compare it to Einstein's theory of relativity.
I don't think I really agree on this. No.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate your talk.
That's an interesting discussion that will make every one of us think by themselves about the points. But we will move on and give Maren the chance to ask her second question.
Actually, it was very similar to Carsten's question about just not knowing the terminology quite as well. So perhaps just a confirmation. For you, a superorganism is only a superorganism if there is strict monogamy between the queen and one male, and all the workers are essentially sterile. And therefore, for that reason, you said that there are such a surprisingly low number of species that would fall into that category, because under the Eusociality, I don't want to call it framework, but if you use that terminology or what you normally find in textbooks, I would think that more bee species and more ant species would be classed as eusocial. But you said that there are very few actually superorganism species. So I completely get that you say that, for example, naked mole rats are not eusocial. I always had a little bit of a problem with that one anyway. But I think I'm not overly familiar with the concept of a superorganism.
Well, I shall be the first to say you can always argue that it's maybe a term that makes some people cringe a little bit. But what is the alternative, right? William Morton Wheeler originally just wrote that these colonies are organismal at a higher level. I actually quoted in one of the slides like that. But then if you systematically use organismal colonies, people may stop seeing the difference between a multicellular animal body and an ant colony. So that's where the term comes from. If you select, because of lifetime monogamy, for obligate collective helping, of course, that might mean that reproductive functionality of the helpers gets lost. In termites, which are diploid, just being uninseminated is enough to be sterile. And that's why I said haplodiploid is really a bit of a quirk, because it happens to be that it doesn't necessarily make you fully sterile if you remain unmated. But I often use the unmatedness criterion as the decisive one. The fact that in ants, bees, and wasps you can then still lay male eggs isn't then violating the theory. It's just a proximate quirk that basically happens, and it leads to a lot of interesting biology about male production in the Hymenoptera. But that's a totally different story. So collective altruism should produce sterility unless you're haplodiploid. But then still, what you see when the castes start developmentally to diverge, you get an optimized queen body for reproduction. You get optimized worker bodies, sometimes multiple castes, optimized for somatic functions in the colony. So that basically confirms that you have a developmental program that is really diverging, and which is at some point quickly, you cannot reverse that anymore. So you have a caste that is functioning as a germline, and you have a caste that's functioning as a soma, but this time at a higher level that we call the superorganismal colony. That's where the analogy is really strong. And Wheeler saw that more than a century ago, and E.O. Wilson glossed that over by suggesting we should understand social evolution from a eusociality continuum type of idea. Does that help?
I think I don't know enough about all these insect species essentially to fully understand the fine tuning, because I think there are ants that can actually, where the workers can actually occasionally reproduce. We had once a talk about.
Yeah, they can. I'm not denying that, and it's, as I'm saying, it makes for very interesting biology. Like we have a whole line of study a couple of decades ago about worker policing, how workers prevent their sister workers from laying eggs, and all that confirms completely to Hamiltonian inclusive fitness reasoning. But it's playing out within a honeybee that has already become superorganismal. So the workers have no way back from being workers. They hatch as somatic bodies. But within that, because they're haplodiploid, there's a lot of interesting dynamics playing out, which again obey what you would normally understand as what inclusive fitness, what theory would tell you should be something you should expect, and other things you should not expect, and you don't tend to find it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Then we have a question by Clara.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Clara B. Jones, and I study social evolution in mammals, and I'm retired. Thank you for this talk. I wanted to show you that I have your book, and I read it a couple of months ago, and there are questions and fascinating statements on every page. Now, I want to look at a bigger picture and ask you, where do you think the field of social evolution, from a major transitions perspective, is going in the next, say, 10, 20 years? And how do you think AI will influence what happens?
These are big questions. Thank you, Clara. I have a few paragraphs in the end of the book that I think where we are going, but perhaps not in my lifetime, is that essentially inclusive fitness theory is a theory of information. It is about information stored in genomes, in genes that get selected if they encode traits that are altruistic. And these are never simple genetics. These are always complex traits encoded by very many different genes of small effects. There is a theory of information by Claude Shannon that is very first principle. And so I'm waiting for people that are medically much more adept than I am to actually start making these links. I think Steve Frank has tried to make some careful beginnings of that. I'm not sure whether Dave has joined that bandwagon, but these are the people to look at, possibly to see that happen. Dave's saying no, he hasn't. Maybe he disagrees that should be a logical way to go. I think that's all I can say, really, because I'm somebody who believes that there is ultimately a theory of everything, and that there is ultimately possibly also a reconciliation of some of the major theories in physics. And I think the information angle is the one to try first, whether we can connect to those kind of theories. Whether artificial intelligence is going to be any use, I really don't know. I am just reading about it. I'm not using any of this myself. So anybody's guess as far as I'm concerned. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then Eduardo had to go, so he cannot ask his question. So I take the liberty to ask one more question. I mean, going to these major transitions you've been talking about, the first to prokaryotic cells and eukaryotes and multicellularity, and the last level, caste societies or superorganisms. And I asked before, and it seems your idea is that these caste societies, with neuters at least, evolved directly from some monogamous ancestors. And it's supposed to be a highly unlikely event to occur, just like it took so long for the first prokaryotes and eukaryotes to evolve. So my question is, if I know it right, but this case of caste society superorganisms evolved multiple times in different lines of hymenopterans at relatively the same time in evolutionary history. How did this and why did this happen? While the other major transitions, I have the feeling, occurred only once, or maybe we only see one.
Yeah, you're right that the major transitions have not been something that's happening all the time. They have been rare and far between, and I try to give us a possible explanation that actually the benefits of obligate altruism need to prevail over the costs of not raising bone offspring for a very long time before you get developmental programs established. So this happened in the ants, in the stingless bees, honeybees, bumblebees as one clade, next sister clade to the orchid bees, which are solitary by and large, and in one wasp clade, the Vespine yellow jacket wasps, and in the termites. The really cool question is whether we will find convergent signatures of selection in the genomes of these things and how they compare to gene expression patterns in systems with helpers at the nest that may be sister clades. My prediction is we will find huge differences. For the superorganismal clades, I expect there will be entire gene regulatory networks that are flexible but yet very accurately canalized, as Waddington called that, to produce a predictable output in terms of a caste phenotype that is either a queen or a worker or a soldier. Whereas compared to those genetic mechanisms, what you see in a Polistes or a halictid society-like thing of cooperative breeders, it will be very shallow. It will be more like perhaps methylation patterns. It will be reversible. So in that sense, I think the mechanistic genetics in the genomic area is starting to come to our help to see whether some of these fundamental differences can indeed be found in these different lineages. But then the question is, of course, whether the superorganismal wasps with their annual colonies will have convergences with superorganismal bumblebee colonies, which are likewise annual. That's a big question. And that will take probably at least 10 years to become clarified. So I don't know whether this was the direction of the question you intended to have it, but I can elaborate differently if you want me to.
It was interesting. It was rather going the direction. Do you think there were at some stage, I don't know when these eusocial clades, most of them evolved, I think it was 80 million years ago or so. Was there something in the environment that triggered the multiple evolution of these major transitions in related clades?
They didn't evolve simultaneously. I think the ants are the oldest. Off the top of my head now, there's a table in my book where I have the sort of more accurate things lined up. The bees were next, and the wasps are relatively recent, maybe 30 million years ago or so for the West Pines, whereas the ants are 150 million years. So we're talking about quite big time spans. The termites are even older, but then only the higher termites are really unambiguously superorganismal, so it's a bit unclear how that fits together. And yeah, so there's no single environmental cue, I would say, that would give you any hope of understanding more.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any further questions, but I see that here in the FIND community we have two very influential scientists that worked on either cooperative breeding, Tim Clattenbrock, or Eusociality, Michael Taborski. And I would like to ask if Tim, Michael, would you be ready to give a short statement from your point of view about the significance of what we heard today, especially to abandon the term Eusociality and instead use condition-dependent and obligate altruism? Tim?
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'd say there's one other issue here, because I would have said that some people are effectively defining eusociality in the same way that Koos is defining superorganismality. So is it not the case that Bernard Crespi, when he's defining eusociality, is actually defining what you would call superorganismality, Koos?
Yes, it's a good point, Tim. You're right that many have come around sorting out this totally hopeless ambiguity of the Wilsonian term by then saying, okay, henceforth we will only use it when we talk about caste. So that's typical for people that work on honeybees to start with, or on ants, right? They will use eusociality that way. Yet at the same time, there is still a non-negligible minority, particularly of halicted bee workers, that use the term eusociality in the sense that Susanna Batra defined it originally. So we still, if you look at the literature a bit more wider, we have that unresolved ambiguity. And that is why I think also historically, because Wheeler was so clear about the analogies with multicellular development in bodies, that it's better to do away with that term altogether, because then we also don't risk anymore that people start calling naked mole rats eusocial, which is more up your alley. And I don't think you're one of them that is fond of that terminology. But it is this continuous risk, right? So as long as we have this term, then we encounter these kind of statements. And it's often in throwaway sentences, often in very non-distinct introductions of papers that people just grab a term or two from the shelf and then come with something that really doesn't make any sense. So yes, I agree. People have found their own homemade solutions for this terminology problem, but it's not necessarily clear to the wider community why they do that.
And I'd have one other point, which is that it seems to me also that it's really important to have a clear definition of castes.
Yeah.
Because in particular with the naked mole rat situation, individuals that become queens can't revert from being queens. They can stop breeding, obviously, but they have the morphology of queens, which is then irreversible. So the workers or the non-breeders in naked mole rats retain the capacity to develop into queens. So that I think there needs to be a clear definition of caste, which suggests that there's a specialization of an irreversible specialization of workers and breeders at an early stage.
Yes.
Would you agree?
I completely agree. But in fact, this is what Wheeler did more than a century ago, and what E.O. Wilson just ignored. And he basically says, okay, let's define caste as any set of behavior.
Yes, okay. But
that includes
full agreement.
Sometimes
yes,
morphological caste differentiation. So again, I think I had it as a bullet point early on in the talk. He messed up Wheeler's definition of caste. And you're completely right. It is irreversible specialization for either a germline-like role or a somatic-like role. And that as Hymenoptera, you can still produce some haploid male-producing eggs, is a secondary mechanism type of thing. It is not fundamental.
Thank you very much. I think I'm in full agreement there.
Okay.
Thank you. Michael, do you have any comments, ideas?
Yeah, perhaps, well, thank you very much, Koos. I always am enlightened by your degree of knowledge of the literature and of the development of ideas and concepts. What I would like to comment perhaps is a very general thing about terms and the usefulness of terms. Because, I mean, eusociality is not the only term that is debated in the field of social behavior. It concerns also common terms like cooperation or altruism and everything, as you know. And I think by showing that the term is problematic because it has been used so differently by different people and has been sort of abused also, you cannot get rid of the term. I think the term eusociality will persist. But I think it is worth trying to find out what the best use is that causes least misunderstandings of underlying biological phenomena and concepts. I think that perhaps might be a better way than just trying to drop the term, because it won't be dropped, I'm afraid.
Well, what I agree, it may be a bit of a uphill battle, but I think the alternative I've been suggesting is to use helper societies and caste society. And I think that covers really well that helper societies you have both in insects and in vertebrates, whereas caste societies you don't have outside the insects. Another thing I would tend to say is, really, do people know what they say when they use the term eusocial? What does it add to just saying social? Nothing, because before the 70s, all people that were thinking about social evolution, mostly in the insects, just were perfectly clear in their writing when they wrote about social insects. They didn't need anything like you before that. So really, it is a bit of a buzzword, and it's sort of, and buzzwords do suggest something that is in some miraculous way interesting. And I think it maybe works for funding agencies if you suddenly find an insect that nobody's ever recognized as social. You just don't write social in your grant proposal, but you say, oh, it may be eusocial. Maybe that does persuade a reviewer or two that this is a priority proposal, right? So it is really, I think, worrying that those sort of things happen, and they happen often without much substance. And so all I can say is that I've made my attempt to try and create some order by going back in the history of our field all the way to Darwin, and I think I understand a fair bit of what made sense in the historical developments and what did not. And I don't think the Wilsonian volumes of the 70s were more than a distraction, really, from the hard part of social evolution studies, as actually that Kitcher volume makes very clear. He talks about pop sociobiology and serious sociobiology. And he connects serious sociobiology directly to Tinbergen, which I can only agree that was the way it should have stayed. But Wilson basically upset a lot of that, right? Basically trying to, even a few years after Tinbergen had received the Nobel Prize, right? Trying to suggest that, oh, ethology is just a fringe phenomenon that will somehow disappear between my population biology and neurobiology, I think it was. There's a figure in one of the first pages of that volume. When you look at that, you kind of go, come on, why did he get away with that? And he did for a lot of time, actually.
It caused, of course, a lot of discussion in the, at least in the German-speaking countries, about the significance of ethology, or say behavioral biology or something. But still, of course, it was a kind of provocative statement that Wilson is sort of famous for, or has been famous for, I think. Anyway, I think you're right that it is worth thinking about the use of terms that have been used in a sort of more unspecified way, but still, I think it would be worth thinking about redefining a term or defining a term in a sort of strict way that would get away with all these inconsistencies, without dropping or trying to drop the term altogether, which I think is, as you say, an uphill race. You can't get rid of a term that has been used so widely over such a long time.
We got rid of the term protoplasm at some point in the mid last century. There have been examples of, I mean, terms going extinct, right? I mean, it's not that they become forbidden, but people will just at some point realize, oh, nobody's actually using this anymore, so maybe I should join that bandwagon. So maybe there's a bit of hope, but I agree, it's hard. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Woods's term of epidiactic display would be a good one that no one would use now. Epidiactic display being a display of a population to show how many there are there, to discourage any further breeding.
Right, yes.
Because he had the idea that societies were there to help limit, to help stop populations actually getting to carrying capacity, with all the disadvantages of that.
Okay, this was a Wynne-Edwards term, or?
This was a Wynne-Edwards term, epidiactic display. So there's hope there, because I haven't heard anyone give a good example of an epidiactic display for many years.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, can I have one more? I mean, whenever you're tempted to use eusocial, think for a few seconds. Would I lose anything if I just wrote social? And I bet you won't. So the parsimonious solution is to write social.
Yeah.
Gosh.
But like Michael said, I mean, the one problem I've been thinking about all the time is, what do I do with teaching? I cannot tell students not anymore about eusociality, but what I will definitely include in my teaching is that eusociality should only be restricted to caste societies, and that maybe caste societies is the better term. And then maybe if more people do that in some time, that abuse of the term eusociality will disappear.
Yeah. But try social for starters.
Yeah, but the point is, students must still be able to talk to other students who use these terms, and then must be able to maybe explain to them. That's a good next questions in the next exams. Why to tell other students not to use this term, for example? But they must be able to still contribute to the discussion and know something about the history of it. And you showed in your talk today that it's very important that we know our history.
But it's about as bad as calling the sun and the moon planets, like people did before Copernicus came, right?
Yeah, but I'm saying that students should be able to say why one should not call that.
Well, but they have
after
very
the planet.
few instruments to do that, I'm afraid. But unless you tell them.
Okay, thanks a lot again for a very fascinating talk today, and thanks to everyone in the FINE community for a great and fascinating discussion, which I think was helpful for all of us. Just to remind you, next week there is no FINE because of Thanksgiving, if I'm not mistaken. And then I hope to see all of you again in 2 weeks when Melanie Damhain is giving a talk on the landscape of fear. I would like to ask Lauren that we stop the